The corridor of the maternity ward smelled of antiseptic and quiet triumph, the kind that comes after long hours of pain and waiting. Nurses moved softly, wheels of carts whispering against polished floors, and behind one of the doors a young woman lay exhausted, her body aching but her heart full in a way she had never known before. She had just given birth, alone except for the muted hum of hospital life, and though she tried to focus on the tiny breaths of her newborn, dread pressed against her chest. She knew her mother-in-law was coming. From the moment the pregnancy was announced, the older woman had made her disapproval clear. There had been sharp comments about timing, about money, about how her son's life was being derailed. When the marriage itself had already been strained, the pregnancy became, in the mother-in-law's eyes, a final insult. She arrived at the hospital with rigid posture and eyes already narrowed, as if the very walls had offended her. Without greeting, without asking about the baby's health, she went straight to accusation. She said the young woman had trapped her son, that she had no right to stay in the family, that once she was discharged, she should leave and never come back. The words cut deeper than any physical pain. The daughter-in-law tried to sit up, clutching the thin blanket, her voice trembling as she asked for time, for peace, for understanding. The older woman only grew harsher, her voice echoing too loudly in a place meant for recovery. Nurses exchanged uneasy glances but hesitated, sensing a family conflict that might explode if touched. The baby began to cry, startled by the rising tension, and that sound only seemed to fuel the mother-in-law's anger. She declared that the child was a mistake, that it would only bring shame and burden. Then the door opened again. At first, no one noticed the man who stepped inside. He didn't raise his voice or interrupt immediately. He simply stood there, taking in the scene, his eyes moving from the shaking young mother to the furious older woman, and finally to the crying infant. When he spoke, it was calm, but the authority in his tone silenced the room. He introduced himself not as a relative, but as someone with documents, with legal standing, with knowledge the mother-in-law clearly did not expect. The surprised guest was a family lawyer and longtime friend of the young woman's late father, a man who had promised years ago to look out for her if she ever needed help. He explained, slowly and clearly, that the apartment the mother-in-law kept threatening to throw her out of did not, in fact, belong solely to her son. It had been partially purchased with funds from the daughter-in-law's father, an arrangement formalized and documented. He went on to say that the young woman and her child were legally protected, that any attempt to force them out would result in immediate legal consequences. The mother-in-law's face drained of color. Her mouth opened as if to argue, but no sound came out. The confidence that had fueled her cruelty evaporated in seconds, replaced by shock and disbelief. For the first time since entering the room, she seemed small, uncertain, exposed. The lawyer didn't stop there. He spoke of responsibility, of how abandonment during such a vulnerable moment could be grounds for serious action. He reminded her that words spoken in anger could carry lasting consequences. The room felt different after that, as if the air itself had shifted. The daughter-in-law exhaled, tears streaming down her face, not from pain this time but from relief. Someone had stood up for her when she was at her weakest. The baby's cries softened, and the nurse finally stepped forward, gently suggesting that the visit was over. The mother-in-law left. Without another word, her heels clicking faintly as she disappeared down the corridor. Later that day, far from the sterile calm of the hospital, another confrontation was unfolding on television screens across the country. Jane Fonda, seasoned actress and lifelong activist, sat opposite NBC News correspondent Jacob Soboroff on the Today Show. What was meant to be a standard interview quickly turned tense. Questions sharpened, probing not just her work but her motives, her past statements, her activism. Jane listened at first, her posture composed, but her eyes betrayed irritation. When she finally responded, it was with controlled fire. She challenged the framing of the questions, calling out what she perceived as oversimplification and bias. Her voice rose, not in anger alone but in conviction, decades of experience pouring into each sentence. She spoke about accountability, about the danger of reducing complex issues into soundbites, about how women, especially outspoken ones, were often expected to soften their truths to make others comfortable. The clash escalated. Jacob attempted to steer the conversation back, but Jane refused to retreat. She reminded the audience that discomfort was sometimes necessary for change, that silence had never moved history forward. The tension was palpable, the kind that makes viewers lean closer to their screens. Some would later call it an eruption, others a justified stand, but no one could deny the power of the moment. In a strange way, the two scenes mirrored each other. In the hospital room, a young woman found her voice through the support of an unexpected ally. On national television, an older woman used her own voice, honed over years, to push back against what she saw as an attempt to corner or diminish her. Both moments were about refusing to be pushed out of a home, out of a conversation, out of dignity. As the day ended, the daughter-in-law cradled her child, whispering promises of safety and strength. She knew challenges still lay ahead, but she also knew she was no longer alone. Somewhere else, Jane Fonda's interview replayed in clips and headlines, sparking debate and admiration in equal measure. Different lives, different stages, yet bound by a common thread. The moment when silence breaks, when someone decides they are rushing to the wrong station if they keep accepting injustice, and chooses instead to stand their ground, no matter who is watching. The maternity ward was unusually quiet for that hour of the afternoon, wrapped in the soft hush that followed visiting time. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting pale stripes across the floor and the neatly made beds. On one of them sat a young woman, her face still drawn from exhaustion, her arms cradling a newborn whose tiny fingers curled instinctively around her thumb. This should have been a moment of peace, of fragile happiness, but tension hung in the air long before the door opened. The mother-in-law entered without knocking, her steps brisk and impatient. She barely glanced at the baby before fixing her gaze on the young woman, eyes sharp with resentment. From the first words out of her mouth, it was clear she hadn't come to offer congratulations. She accused, scolded, and lectured, her voice cutting through the calm like broken glass. She said the birth had complicated everything, that her son was not ready for this responsibility, and that the young woman had no place in their family anymore. The daughter-in-law tried to speak, her voice weak but steady, asking for time, for respect, for the chance to recover. She reminded her that she had just given birth, that the baby needed calm, not conflict. The older woman waved her off, dismissing her words as excuses. She leaned closer, lowering her voice only enough to make the threat feel more intimate. Once discharged, she said, the young woman would be expected to leave. There would be no home, no support, no second chances. Tears welled in the young mother's eyes, not just from fear but from the crushing weight of betrayal. She had endured months of cold remarks and subtle cruelty, but this was different. This was an attempt to erase her at her most vulnerable moment. The baby stirred, sensing distress, and let out a thin cry. A nurse hovered near the door, unsure whether to intervene, knowing that family conflicts could quickly turn volatile. Then, unexpectedly, another figure appeared in the doorway. He was an older man with calm eyes and a composed demeanor, carrying a leather folder under his arm. He apologized softly for interrupting and asked if this was the room he was looking for. The mother-in-law turned, irritation flashing across her face, ready to dismiss him, but paused when he introduced himself. He was a legal representative, he explained, and a longtime acquaintance of the young woman's family. As he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. He spoke clearly and without hostility, explaining that he had been asked to be present in case there were misunderstandings about the young woman's rights. He opened the folder and began to outline facts the mother-in-law clearly hadn't expected to hear. The apartment she threatened to evict her from was partially funded through a formal agreement involving the young woman's late father. The paperwork was valid, binding, and protected her residency and her child's future. Each sentence seemed to strip away the older woman's confidence. Her rigid posture faltered, her mouth tightening as she struggled to respond. The lawyer continued, explaining the legal implications of harassment and forced eviction, especially in the immediate aftermath of childbirth. He spoke not with aggression, but with certainty, the kind that leaves little room for denial. Silence followed. The mother-in-law stood frozen, the words she had prepared dissolving before they reached her lips. For the first time, she looked not powerful but exposed. The nurse stepped in then, gently suggesting that the patient needed rest and that the visit should end. Without another word, the older woman turned and left, her footsteps echoing down the hall, each one sounding less certain than the last. The young mother exhaled shakily, clutching her baby closer. Relief washed over her in waves, mingled with disbelief. She thanked the man quietly, her voice breaking as she did. He smiled kindly and told her she was stronger than she realized, that sometimes help arrived in unexpected forms. Elsewhere, in a brightly lit television studio, another confrontation was unfolding, though of a very different kind. Jane Fonda sat across from NBC News journalist Jacob Soboroff on the Today Show, poised and attentive as the interview began. At first, the exchange was measured, touching on her latest projects and ongoing activism. But as the questions turned sharper, the tone shifted. Jacob pressed her on controversial moments from her past, framing them in a way that suggested contradiction or hypocrisy. Jane listened, her expression tightening slightly, her patience thinning with each interruption. When she finally responded, her voice carried unmistakable force. She challenged the premise of the questions, arguing that they reduced decades of advocacy into convenient narratives designed to provoke rather than inform. The conversation grew tense. Jane spoke about the responsibility of journalists to provide context, about how women in public life were often scrutinized differently, their passion labeled as aggression. She refused to soften her words, insisting that activism was not meant to be comfortable. Jacob attempted to redirect, but Jane held her ground, articulating her points with clarity sharpened by years of experience. Viewers watching at home could sense the electricity in the room. This was not a rehearsed moment, but a real clash of perspectives. Jane's frustration was evident, but so was her resolve. She made it clear that she would not be cornered or silenced for the sake of politeness. In an unexpected parallel, both scenes told the same underlying story. In a hospital room, a young woman faced an attempt to push her out of her own life, only to be saved by truth and support arriving at the right moment. On live television, an older woman refused to be boxed in by framing she found unfair, choosing instead to assert her voice, even at the risk of controversy. By the end of the day, the young mother rocked her baby gently, the fear that had gripped her earlier replaced by cautious hope. She knew challenges remained, but she also knew she was not powerless. Meanwhile, Jane Fonda's interview rippled across media and social platforms, sparking debate, criticism, and admiration in equal measure. Two different lives, two different stages, yet both defined by moments of resistance. Moments when silence was no longer an option, when standing still meant being pushed aside. In choosing to speak, to confront, to refuse injustice, both women reminded the world that dignity is not granted by others. It is claimed, sometimes quietly in a hospital room, sometimes loudly under studio lights, but always with lasting impact.